Hi everyone! Today we're going to be making a classic white sandwich bread. You can see the final result here. Make sure you do the steps in the same order I do in this video. Usually it doesn't matter too much. With this recipe it does. Start with 300 grams of water. That's 1 cup plus 2 tablespoons if you don't have a digital scale. This is the first thing in your bowl. The second is going to be honey. Now I use a local honey that I purchase because Tampa's made of pollen and it helps with my allergies, but you can use store-bought as well. Go ahead and put in 32 grams of this. That is 1 heaping tablespoon. And you'll see that I'm doing this in a bowl on top of a digital scale. The digital scale is the most important tool in my kitchen. I highly encourage you to get one. It will help your baking. Follow this with 2.5 teaspoons of yeast that you put on one side of the bowl, followed by 2 teaspoons of salt on the opposite side of the bowl. The next step is butter. There's going to be 2 tablespoons of butter. You want it to be room temperature, and I cut it into smaller bits because it makes it easier to integrate fully into the dough. Next is your flour. That's going to be 500 grams. Use either all-purpose or bread flour, whatever you have on hand. I'm using bread flour. That's because that's what I have in my pantry. And lastly is an ingredient that we haven't seen before in these tutorials, and that's non-fat dry milk. You can also use what's called baker's milk. And if you don't have this dry powdered milk, you can substitute it for the same amount of actual liquid milk. You'll just have to add a little bit more flour to make sure that the consistency isn't too wet. This is a much drier dough than we worked with last week. You don't want it to be incredibly sticky. So if you use regular milk, you really will have to add in quite a bit of flour to make sure you get that consistency. At this point, put the dough in your mixer. You want speed 2. Again, that's for the health of the motor in your mixer. And do it for 6 to 8 minutes with your dough hook. If you don't have a mixer and you're doing this by hand, it's more likely to take you about 10 minutes. At the end of this time, pull out the dough and put it in a bowl that you've already prepared that's lightly oiled. You can use some sort of baking or cooking spray or pretty much any type of oil. The only ones that I really avoid using here are coconut oil and sesame oil because that will impart more flavor than your standard vegetable oil or olive oil. Sprinkle some flour on top. That will keep it from drying out while it rises for 60 to 90 minutes. At the end of that time, you're going to gently remove the dough from the bowl. I use this special scraper here. You can use your hands. The idea, though, is to not knock out all of the air by being rough with the dough at this stage. Now, we're going to be shaping this dough differently than last week's tutorial, and that's because the way we shape it now will give it the structure meant that will turn it into more of a grocery store style sandwich bread. Sprinkle your worktop with some flour, and then you're going to form a more or less rectangle that's slightly shorter than whatever vessel you'll be baking this in. You'll see I'm using my actual fingers rather than my heels to flatten the dough a little bit, and then take the top part and bring it down about 1/3 of the way and use the palm of your hand to gently close the dough. And then do the same thing with the opposite side. You're going to fold it about 1/3 of the way, and again use your heel to close the seam. Once this is complete, fold it in half, and once more, use the heel of your hand to seal the edges here. You may need to adjust the dough slightly. If it's a little bit long, feel free to gently push it inward, and then take your baking vessel and put the dough inside. You can do this in a casserole dish like I am here. You can do it in an actual bread loaf tin. The idea, though, is that it fits snugly and has support in the walls of the vessel in order to support its rise in the oven. Let it rise for an hour. Preheat your oven to 350. This is the end result. What we do to get here is we bake it in the oven at 350 for 20 minutes, and then tent it with foil and bake it for another 15 to 20 minutes. And then you'll end up with this lovely loaf of bread. As always, thank you for playing along and happy baking!